Part 2 of The Return by H. Beam Piper. Read by Reynard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Return by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 5. They lunched together at the house of Toon Sarge Hughes, with the Toon leader and the reader and 5 or 6 of the leaders of the community. The food was plentiful, but Altamont found himself wishing that the first book they found in the Carnegie Library crypt would be a cookbook. In the afternoon, he and Ludens separated. Ludens attached himself to the tenant, the reader, and an old woman, Irene Klein, who was almost 100 years old and was the repository and arbiter of most of the community's oral legends. Altamont, on the other hand, started with Alex Barrett, the gunsmith, and Mordecai Reetzy, the miller, to inspect the gun shop and the grist mill. They were later joined by half a dozen more of the village craftsmen, and so also visited the forge and foundry, the sawmill and the wagon shop. Altamont additionally looked at the flume, a rough structure of logs lined with sheet aluminium, and at the nitriary, a shed-roofed pit in which potassium nitrate was extracted from the community's animal refuse. But he reversed matters when it came to visiting the powder mill on the island. He became the host and took them by helicopter to the island, and then for a trip up the river. The guests were a badly scared lot, for the first few minutes as they watched the ground receding under them through the transparent plastic nose. Then, when nothing serious seemed to be happening, exhilaration took the place of fear. By the time they set down on the tip of the island, the 8 men were confirmed aviation enthusiasts. The trip upriver was an even bigger success, the high point coming when Altamont set his controls for hover, pointed out a snarl of driftwood in the stream, and allowed his passengers to fire one of the machine guns at it. The lead balls of their own black powder rifles would have plunked into the waterlogged wood without visible effect. The copper-jacketed machine gun bullets ripped it to splinters. They returned for a final visit to the distillery, awed by what they had seen. Chapter 6. Monty, I don't know what the devil to make of this crowd, Ludens said that evening after the feast, when they had entered the helicopter and were preparing to retire. We've run into some weird communities. That lot down in New Mexico who live in the church and claim that they have a divine mission to redeem the world by prayer, fasting and flagellation. Or the Blackout Boys in Detroit, Altamont interrupted. He had good reason to remember them. That's understandable, Ludens said, after what their ancestors went through in the last war. And so are the others, in their own way. But this crowd here... Ludens put down his cigar and began chewing on his moustache, a sure sign that he was more than puzzled. He was a very worried man. Altamont respected his partner's abilities in this area. However, he also knew that the best way to get his friend to work any problem was to have him do it in conversation. What has you stopped, Jim? Number of things, Monty. They're hard to explain because... The sociologist shrugged, winced a little as the gesture pushed his leg down on the edge of his bunk. Well, let me just mention them. These people are the descendants of an old United States Army platoon, but they have a fully developed religion centered on a slain and resurrected God. Now, Monty, with all due respect to the old US Army, that just doesn't make sense. Normally, it would take thousands of years for a slain God religion to develop, and then only in a special situation from the field fertility magic of primitive agriculturalists. Well, you saw those people's fields from the air. Some members of that old platoon were men who knew the latest methods of scientific farming. They didn't need naive fairy tales about the planting and germination of seed. Sure this religion isn't just a variation of Christianity? Absolutely not. In the first place, these sacred books cannot be the Bible. You heard Tenant Jones say that they mentioned firearms that use cartridges. That means they can't be older than 1860 at the earliest. And in the second place, this slain God wasn't crucified or put to death by any form of execution. He perished together with his enemy in combat, and both God and devil were later resurrected. Ludens picked up his cigar again. By the way, the enemy is supposed to be the mastermind back of these cannibal savages in the woods, and also in the ruins. Did you get a look at these sacred books, or find out what they might be? Ludens shook his head disgustedly. Every time I brought up the question, they evaded me. The tenant sent the reader out to bring in this old lady, Irene Klein. She was a perfect goldmine of information about the history and traditions of the platoon, by the way. And then he sent the reader out on some other errand, undoubtedly to pass the word around not to talk to us about their religion. I don't get that, Altamont said. They showed me everything. Their gun shop, their powder mill, their defences, everything. He smoked in silence for a moment, then added in an apologetic tone. Jim, I'm sure you've thought of this. The slain god couldn't be the original platoon commander, could he? I've thought of it, and he isn't, Monty. No, definitely not. They have the greatest respect for his memory, decorate his grave regularly, drink toasts to him and so on, but he hasn't been deified. They got the idea for this god of theirs out of the sacred books. Ludens put the cigar down again and returned to chewing his moustache. Monty, this has me worried like the devil. I believe that they suspect that you are the slain and risen one. Altamont considered the idea, then nodded slowly. Could be at that. I know the tenant came up to me very respectfully and said, I hope you don't think, sir, that I was presumptuous in trying to display my humble deductive abilities to you. What did you say? Ludens demanded, rather sharply. Told him certainly not. That he'd used a good, quick method of demonstrating that he and his people weren't like those mindless subhumans in the woods. That was all right, Ludens approved. But then his worries returned. I don't know how we're going to handle this. Jim, how about that POWs business? Is there something there? Monty, Ludens' voice was dryly chiding as he took a pad of paper and scribbled briefly. Take a look and figure for yourself. Altamont looked at the paper. Ludens had simply printed the first 3 letters of the word in capitals and separated each letter with a period. Ouch! Yes, of course. That's what an infantry platoon would be guarding. Go ahead, Jim. This is in your end of our business. I'll stay out of it, and especially I'll keep my mouth shut. I don't think you'll be able to, Ludens said soberly. As things stand now, they only suspect that you are their deity. And that means this. We're on trial here. We have been in spots like this before, Jim, Altamont reminded his friend. Not like this, Monty, and let me explain. I get the impression here that logic, not faith, is the supreme religious virtue. And get this, Monty, because it's something practically unheard of, skepticism is a religious obligation, not a sin. I wish I knew. Chapter 7. Tenant Mycroft Jones, Reader Stamford Rawson, Toon Sarge Verner Hughes, and his son, Murray Hughes, sat around the bare-topped table in the room on the second floor of the HQ house. A lighted candle flickered in the cool breeze that came in through the open window, throwing their shadows back and forth on the walls. "Pass the Tantalus, Murray," the tenant said, and the youngest of the four handed the corncob corked bottle to the eldest. Tenant Jones filled his cup and then sat staring at it, while Verner Hughes thrust his pipe into the toe of the moccasin and filled it. Finally, the tenant drank about half the clear, wild plum brandy. "Gentlemen, I'm baffled," he confessed. "We have 3 alternate possibilities here, and we dare not disregard any of them. Either this man who calls himself Altamont is truly he, or his is merely what we are asked to believe, one of the community of men like ours with more of the old knowledge than we possess." "You know my views," Verner Hughes said. "I cannot believe that he was more than a man, as we are. A great, a good, a wise man, but a man and mortal." "Let's not go into that now." The Reader emptied his cup and took the bottle, filling it again. "You know my views too. I hold that he is no longer upon earth in the flesh, but lives in the spirit, and is only with us in the spirit." "But you said that there were 3 possibilities, none of which can be eliminated. What was your third possibility, Tenant?" "That they are creatures of the enemy. Perhaps one or the other of them is the enemy." Reader Rawson, lifting his cup to his lips, almost strangled. The Hugheses, father and son, stared at Tenant Jones in horror. "The enemy? With such weapons and resources?" Murray Hughes gasped. Then he emptied his cup and refilled it. "No, I can't believe that. He would have struck before this and wiped us all out." "Not necessarily, Murray," the tenant replied. "Until he became convinced that his agents, the Scourers, could do nothing against us, he would bide his time. He sits motionless, like a spider, at the centre of the web. He does little himself. His agents are numerous. Or perhaps he wishes to recruit us into this hellish organization." "It is a possibility," the Reader admitted, "and one which we can neither accept or reject safely. And we must learn the truth as soon as possible. If this man is really he, we must not spurn him on mere suspicions. If he is a man come to help us, we must accept his help. If he is speaking the truth, the people who sent him could do wonders for us, and the greatest wonder would be to make us again a part of a civilized community. And if he is the enemy?" Rawson left the sentence unfinished, but his face was grim. "But if he is really he," Murray said, a little diffidently, for he was not yet accustomed to being included in the council of the elders, "I think we are on trial." "What do you mean, son?" "Oh, I see. Of course, I don't believe that he is, but that's mere doubt, not negative certainty. However, if I'm wrong, if this man is truly he, we are worthy of him, we will penetrate his disguise." "A very pretty problem, gentlemen," the tenant said, smacking his lips over his brandy. "For all that it may be a deadly serious one for us. There is, of course, nothing we can do tonight, but tomorrow we have promised to help our visitors, whoever they may be, in searching for this crypt in the city. Murray, you were to be in charge of the detail that was to accompany him. Carry on as arranged, and say nothing of our suspicions, but advise your men to keep a sharp watch on the strangers, that they may learn all they can from them. Stamford, you and Verner and I will go along. We should, if we have any wits at all, observe something." Chapter 8. "Listen to this infernal thing," Altamont raged. "Wielding a gold-plated spade, handled with oak from an original rafter of the Congressional Library at 3:15 one afternoon last week. One afternoon last week? He cursed luridly. Why couldn't that blasted magazine say what afternoon? I've gone over a lot of 20th century copies of that magazine, and that expression was a regular cliché with them. Ludens looked over his shoulder at the photostated magazine page. Well, we know it was between June 13 and 19, inclusive, he said, and there's a picture of the university president, complete with gold-plated spade, breaking ground. Call it Wednesday the 16th. Over there's the tip of the shadow of the old Cathedral of Learning, about 100 yards away. There are so many inexactitudes that one will probably cancel out the other. That's so, and it's also pretty futile getting angry at somebody who's been dead 200 years. But why couldn't they say Wednesday, or Monday, or Saturday, or whatever? Monty checked back in the astronomical handbook and the photostated pages of the old almanac, then looked over his calculations. All right, here is the angle of the shadow and the compass bearing. I had a look yesterday when I was taking the local citizenry on that junket. The old baseball diamond at Forbes Fields is plainly visible, and I located the ruins of the Cathedral of Learning from that. Here's the above sea level altitude of the top of the tower. After you've landed us, go up to this altitude. Use the barometric altimeter, not the radar, and hold position. Ludens leaned forward from the desk to the contraption Altamont had rigged up in the nose of the helicopter. One of the telescope-sighted hunting rifles clamped in a vise, with a compass and a spirit level under it. Rifles pointing downward at the correct angle now? He asked. Good. Then all I have to do is to hold the helicopter steady, keep it at the right altitude, level, and pointed in the right direction, and watch through the sight while you move the flag around, and direct you by radio. Simple if I had been born quintuplets. Mr. Altamont? Dr. Ludens? A voice outside the helicopter called. Are you ready for us now? Altamont went to the open door and looked out. The old Toon leader, the reader, Toon Sarge Hughes, his son, and 4 young men in buckskins with slung rifles were standing outside. I have decided, the tenant said, that Mr. Rawson and Sarge Hughes and I would be of more help than an equal number of young men. We may not be as active, but we do know the old ruins better, especially the paths and hiding places of the Scourers. These 4 young men you probably met last evening, but it will be no harm to introduce them again. Birdie Edwards, Sholto Jimenez, Jefferson Burns, Murdo Olson. Very pleased, Tenant, gentlemen. I met all of you young men last evening, and I remember you, Altamont said. Now, if you'll crowd in here, I'll explain what we're going to try to do. He showed them the old picture. You see where the shadow of a tall building falls? He asked. We know the height and location of this building. Dr. Ludens will hold this helicopter at exactly the position of the top of the building and aim through the sights of the rifle, there. One of you will have this flag in his hand and will move it back and forth. Dr. Ludens will tell us when the flag is in sight of the rifle. He'll need a good pair of lungs to do that, Verner Hughes commented. We'll use the radio, a portable set on the ground, and the helicopter's radio set, Altamont said. To his surprise, he was met with looks of incomprehension. He had not supposed that these people would have lost all memory of radio communication. Why, that's wonderful, the reader exclaimed, when the explanation was concluded. You can talk directly. How much better than just sending a telegram? But finding the crypt by the shadow, that's exactly like the... Murray Hughes began, then stopped short. Immediately he began talking about the rifle that was to be used as a surveying transit, comparing it with the ones in the big first-floor room at the HQ house. Locating the point where the shadow of the old Cathedral of Learning had fallen proved easier than either Altamont or Ludens had expected. The towering building was now a tumbled mass of slagged rubble, but it was quite possible to determine its original centre, and with the old data from the excellent reference library at Fort Ridgeway, its height above sea level was known. After a little jockeying, the helicopter came to a hovering stop, and the slanting barrel of the rifle in the vise pointed downward along the line of the shadow that had been cast on that afternoon in June 1993. The crosshairs of the scope sight centred almost exactly on the spot Altamont had estimated on the map. Guiding himself by peering through the rifle sight, Ludens brought the helicopter slanting down to land on the sheet of fused glass that had once been a grassy campus. "Well, this is probably it," Altamont said. "We didn't have to bother fussing around with that flag after all. That hump over there looks as though it had been a small building, and there's nothing corresponding to it on the city map. That may be the bunker over the stairhead to the crypt." They began unloading equipment. A small portable nuclear electric conversion unit, a powerful solenoid hammer, crowbars and entrenching tools, tins of blasting plastic. They took out the 2 hunting rifles and the auto carbine, and Altamont showed the young men of Murray Hughes Detail how to use them. "If you'll pardon me, sir," the tenant said to Altamont, "I think it would be a good idea if your companion went up in the flying machine and circled over us, to keep watch for the scourers. There are quite a few of them, particularly further up the rivers, to the east, where the damage was not so great, and they can find cellars and shelters and buildings to live in." "Good idea. That way we won't have to put out guards," Altamont said. "From the looks of this, we'll need everybody to help dig into that thing. Hand out one of those portable radios, Jim, and go up to about 1,000 feet. If you see anything suspicious, give us a yell, then spray it with bullets, and find out what it is afterward." They waited until the helicopter had climbed to position and was circling above, and then turned their attention to the place where the sheet of fused earth and stone bulged upward. It must have been almost ground zero of one of the hydrogen bombs. The wreckage of the Cathedral of Learning had fallen predominantly to the north, and the Carnegie Library was tumbled to the east. "I think the entrance would be on this side, toward the library," Altamont said. "Let's try it to begin with." He used the solenoid hammer, slowly pounding a hole in the glaze, and placed a small charge of the plastic explosive. Chunks of the lava-like stuff pelted down between the little mound and the huge one of the old library, blowing a hole 6 feet in diameter and the 2.5 feet deep, revealing concrete bonded with crushed steel mill slag. "We missed the door," Altamont said. "That means we'll have to tunnel in through who knows how much concrete. Well." He used a second and larger charge after digging a hole a foot deep. When he and his helpers came up to look, they found a large mass of concrete blown out, and solid steel behind it. Altamont cut 2 more holes, one on either side of the blown out place, and fired a charge in each of them, bringing down more concrete. He found he hadn't missed the door after all. It had merely been concreted over. A few more shots cleared it, and after some work they got it open. There was a room inside, concrete floored and entirely empty. Altamont stood in the doorway and inspected the interior with his flashlight. He heard somebody behind him say something about a most peculiar sort of dark lantern. Across the small room, on the opposite wall, was a bronze plaque. The plaque carried quite a lengthy inscription, including the names of all the persons and institutions participating in the microfilm project. The history department at the fort would be interested in that, but the only thing that interested Altamont was the statement that the floor had been laid over the trapdoor leading to the vault where the microfilms were stored. He went outside to the radio. "Hello, Jim. We're inside, but the films were stored in an underground vault, and so we have to tear up a concrete floor," he said. "Go back to the village and gather up all the men you can carry. I don't want to use explosives inside. The interior of the crypt oughtn't to be damaged. Besides, I don't know what a blast in there might do to the film, and I don't want to take any chances." "No, of course not. How thick do you think the floor is?" "Haven't the least idea. Plenty thick, I would guess. Those films would have to be well buried to shield them from radioactivity. We can expect that it will take some time." "All right, I'll be back as soon as I can." The helicopter turned and went windmilling away, over what had been the Golden Triangle, down the Ohio. Altamont went back to the little concrete bunker and sat down, lighting his pipe. Murray Hughes and his 4 riflemen spread out, one circling around the glazed butt that had been the Cathedral of Learning, another climbing to the top of the old library, and the others taking positions to the south and east. Altamont sat in silence, smoking his pipe and trying to form some conception of the wealth under that concrete floor. It was no use. Jim Loudons probably understood a little more clearly what those books would mean to the world of today, and what they could do towards shaping the world of the future. There was a library at Fort Ridgeway, and it was an excellent one, for its purpose. In 1996, when the rockets had come crashing down, it had contained the cream of the world's technical knowledge, and very little else. There was only a little fiction, a few books of ideas, just enough to give the survivors a tantalizing glimpse of the world of their fathers. But now... A rifle banged to the south and east, and banged again. Either Murray Hughes or Birdie Edwards. It was one of the 2 hunting rifles from the helicopter. On the heels of the reports, they heard a voice shouting, "Scourers! A lot of them, coming from up the river!" A moment later, there was a light whip-crack of one of the muzzle-loaders from the top of the old Carnegie Library, and Altamont could see a wisp of grey-white smoke drifting away from where it had been fired. Altamont jumped to his feet and raced to the radio, picking it up and bringing it to the bunker. Lieutenant Jones, old Reader Rawson, and Verner Hughes had caught up their rifles. The Tenant was shouting, "Come on in! Everybody, come on in!" The boy on top of the library began scrambling down. Another came running from the direction of the half-demolished Cathedral of Learning. A third from the baseball field that had served as Altamont's point of reference the afternoon before. The fourth, Murray Hughes, was running in from the ruins of the old Carnegie Tech building, and Birdie Edwards sped up the main road from Shenley Park. Once, twice as he ran, Murray Hughes paused, turned, and fired behind him. Then his pursuers came into sight. They ran erect. They wore a few rags of skin garments, and they carried spears and hatchets and clubs, so they were probably classifiable as men. But their hair was long and unkempt, and their bodies were almost black with dirt and from the sun. A few of them were yelling, but most of them ran silently. They ran more swiftly than the boys they were pursuing. The distance between them narrowed every moment. There were at least 50 of them. Verner Hughes's rifle barked. One of them dropped. As coolly as though he were shooting squirrels instead of his son's pursuers, he dropped the butt of the rifle to the ground, poured a charge of powder, patched a ball and rammed it home, replaced the ramrod. Lieutenant Jones fired then, and Birdie Edwards joined them, beginning to shoot with the telescope-sighted rifle. The young man, who had been north of the Cathedral of Learning, had one of the auto-carbines. Luckily, Altamont had providentially set the control for semi-auto before giving it to him. He dropped to one knee and began to empty the clip, shooting slowly and deliberately, picking off the runners who were in the lead. The boy who had started to climb down off the library halted, fired his flintlock and began reloading it. Altamont, sitting down and propping his elbows on his knees, took both hands to the automatic, which was his only weapon, emptying the magazine and replacing it. The last 3 savages he shot in the back. They had had enough and were running for their lives. So far, everybody was safe. The boy in the library came down through a place where the wall had fallen. Murray Hughes stopped running and came slowly toward the bunker, putting a fresh clip into his rifle. The others came drifting in. "Altamont calling Ludens," the scientist from Fort Ridgeway was saying into the radio. "Monty to Jim, can you hear me?" Silence. "We'd better get ready for another attack," Birdie Edwards said. "There's another gang coming from down that way. I never saw so many Scourers." "Maybe there's a reason, Birdie," Tenant Jones said. "The enemy is after big game this time." "Jim, where the devil are you?" Altamont fairly yelled into the radio. And as he did, he knew the answer. Ludens was in the village, away from the helicopter, gathering tools and workers. Nothing to do but keep on trying. "Here they come," Reader Rawson warned. "How far can these rifles be depended on?" Birdie Edwards wanted to know. Altamont straightened, saw the second band of savages approaching about 400 yards away. "Start shooting now," he said. "Aim for the upper part of their bodies." The two auto-loading rifles began to crack. After the first few shots, the savages took cover. Evidently they understood the capabilities and limitations of the villagers' flintlocks, but this was a terrifying surprise to them. "Jim!" Altamont was almost praying into the radio. "Come in, Jim!" "What is it, Monty? I was outside." Altamont told him. "Those fellows you had with you yesterday, think they could be trusted to handle the guns? A couple of them are here with me," Ludens inquired. "Take a chance on it. It won't cost anything but my life, and that's not worth much at the present." "All right, hold on. We'll be there in a few minutes." "Ludens is bringing the helicopter," Altamont told the others. "All we have to do is hold on here until he comes." A naked savage raised his head from behind what might, 200 years ago, have been a cement park bench, and he was only 100 yards away. Reader Rawson promptly killed him and began reloading. "I think you're right, Tenant," he said. "The Scourers have never attacked in bands like this before. They must have a powerful reason, and I can think of only one." "That's what I'm beginning to think too," Verner Hughes agreed. "At least we've eliminated the third of your possibilities, Tenant, and I think probably the second as well." Altamont wondered what they were double talking about. There wasn't any particular mystery about the mass attack of the wild men to him. Debased as they were, they still possessed speech and the ability to transmit experiences. No matter how beclouded in superstition, they still remembered that aircraft dropped bombs, and bombs killed people, and where people had been killed, they would find fresh meat. They had seen the helicopter circling about, and had heard the blasting. Everyone in the area had been drawn to the scene as soon as Ludens had gone down the river. But they seemed to have forgotten that aircraft carried guns, although they did spring to their feet and start to run at the return of the helicopter. However, most of them did not run far. Chapter 9. Altamont and Ludens shook hands many times in front of the HQ house, and listened to many good wishes and repeated their promise to return. Most of the microfilmed books were to be stored in the old church. They were taking with them only the catalogue and a few of the most important works. Finally, they entered the helicopter. The crowd shouted farewell as they rose. Altamont, at the controls, waited until they had gained 5,000 feet, then turned on a compass course for Colony 3. "I can't wait until we're in range of the fort, Jim. This is one report I really want to make," he said. "Of all the wonderful luck," he went on, "and I don't know which is the more important, finding these books or finding those people. In a few years, when we get them supplied with modern equipment and instructed in its use." "What's the matter, Jim? You should be even more excited than I am." "I'm not very happy about this, Monty," Ludens confessed. "I keep thinking about what's going to happen to them." "Why, nothing's going to happen to them. they're going to be given the means of producing more food, keeping more of them alive, giving them more leisure to develop themselves in... Monty, I saw the sacred books. The deuce! What were they? It. One volume. A collection of works. We have it at the fort, and I've read it. How I ever missed all those clues. You see, Monty, what I'm worried about is what's going to happen to those people when they find out that we're not really Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. End of The Return by H. Beam Piper.